Good morning. In the classical world, really right up to modern day, there's one thing that struck fear into people more than anything else, and that was illness. Because if you got ill, you were in the lap of the gods. Yes, you had medicines, you had remedies, but they didn't work. Everyone knew they didn't work. It was desperation and hope. And so if you had the means, if you had the money, if you had the wellness about you to come and visit, you would come here to Epidaurus, which was the main centre of healing in the classical world. It's dedicated to the god of Asclepius, the god of healing. And this place, I'm not going to talk about this place itself. I want to talk about the people who would have come here, because I think that's the interesting thing. So the people coming here would have been desperate. You would make a very long journey across the known world at the time, potentially risking your life just to get here in order to be healed, in the hope, the desperate hope, and it's all about desperation and hope, that you would be healed. And let's say you were coming from Anatolia or you were coming from Egypt. You would come into a port about 15 kilometres from here called Epidaurus, and it would have been a very big commercial enterprise, and you would have landed, you've been taken off the boat with your family. Let's say you might have been a child, you might have been a wife, you might have been an elderly father, whoever you were, being brought here by your family in the desperate hope you were going to be healed, and you'd be put on a truck and brought up a road that ran directly from Epidaurus to this site here, this religious centre of healing, renowned in the classical world. Number one, only second and third really to Olympia and Delphi in terms of its religious importance in the classical world. And you would have come here and stayed potentially weeks or months if you could have afforded it. And you would have done three things here. Firstly, you would pray. This is the temple of Asclepius, and this is the main temple. There are numerous temples here. Temple to Apollo, temple to Artemis, etc. But this was the main temple, and this is where you would hope that your prayers would be heard, and Asclepius, the god of healing, would grant your wishes and make yourself healthy again. However, you would be taken through a process, and this was a commercial process. What started here as, in the 6th century BC, a religious cult became in some ways a corrupted commercial enterprise. It was a bit like the monasteries in England in the 15th century. They were money-making enterprises. They were using religion and people's fear of the future and death and health and everything else to make money. And I don't think it was any different here. This was essentially a religious spa resort designed and built in the form that we see now for commercial money making. I have to be honest about it. But the building behind me, you would go in there, you would be given psychotropic drugs, LSD if you like, and you would sleep there for the night. And during that night, you would have vivid dreams. The god Asclepius would visit you, and he would tell you what healing you needed. You would relate your dreams the next morning for a fee to the priest, and the priest would tell you what healing process you needed to go through. So you would then be taken through the healing process that happened to exist obviously here within this site, again for a fee, and hopefully that healing process, because it had been given to you under psychotropic drugs by the god Asclepius, would result in your healing. Now, obviously not everyone was ultimately successful. There were some miraculous healings. They're attested to in the museum here. There are many cartouche stones carved with thanks to the god Asclepius for the miraculous healing they could. But if you were going to die, they also managed that for you in this tholos behind me, this round building. Now, in my experience in Greece, round buildings only mean one thing: memorial and death. And you would have been, if you were passing into the afterlife, taken through a process down into the basement of this building, which we can't unfortunately see. There were 3 concentric rings, and you would have been gradually moved to the centre of the basement of the building, where hopefully, if the timing was right, you would pass on into the afterlife, and it would give you some comfort in doing so. So your desperation and hope were tinged with comfort, and ultimately this is what religion's about, isn't it? The desperate have hope in life and comfort in death, and it was no different in ancient times. They came here, particularly in the 4th century BC, in vast numbers to populate this site in the desperate hope that they would be healed, and then the comfort that if they weren't, they would be facilitated down into the afterlife. I mentioned that this place was perhaps corrupted to an extent by commercialisation, just as in medieval times, you know, monasteries became sites of pilgrimage. They were money-making machines. This was too. And everything you see beyond these three buildings that we've looked at, the Temple of Asclepius, the Abdion, the hospital, the place where you dreamt, and the Tholos, everything was built to make money from the pilgrims who were coming here, the desperately ill. It was effectively trading on their desperation and their hope. And desperate and weak are often easily taken for their money. And I don't wish to do this place down, because I'm sure it wasn't perceived that way in classical times when it was popular. But this place was about making money, and everything you see outside those three core religious buildings was about making money, including the theatre here, the stadium here. So I mentioned that people would come from across the classical world to visit this site in the desperate hope that they would be healed. Well, this area here was dedicated to the Egyptian gods, and for the Egyptians who were visiting this site with their elderly, with their infirm, with their children who perhaps desperately needed healing, this was a place of harmony. But it was all about making you feel comfortable. The religious experience, the commercial experience, the entertainment here, all about giving you hope and making you stay here and spend more. You come here sometimes for months. You've made a huge journey across the classical world to visit. You need somewhere to stay. If you're rich enough, you stay in the Catagogion. This is the Catagogion. It was a 160-room hotel. It had 4 courtyards with rooms arranged around each courtyard. It was one large building, 2 floors. And sometimes if you were rich enough, you'd have a room to yourself or several rooms to yourself and your family. If perhaps you weren't so rich, but you still had money, you would share a room with several people. But at the same time, you needed to eat. And behind me is the Hestiatorium, this slightly rebuilt building here. I hope you can see it properly. But this was the banqueting hall. And every night you would come here, or your family would come here if you were too ill, and you would eat lavishly, because if you're living on this site and you're not just visiting for the day because you're spending all your money just on one day, you'll be eating here every night for months, morning, noon and night, and eating lavishly. And you would get to know people here. You would live their journeys. You would live their stories here. This was a place just like any spa retreat or retirement home. If you were rich enough, you got to know your neighbours, you got to know their stories, you became personally entwined with them and followed their journeys through here. So as well as giving you your religious experience and feeding you and housing you, the obvious thing in any commercial venture is to sell you things. And this area here was the Greek agora. That basically means shopping centre. And I can just envisage, in a very mild-mannered way, the priest suggesting to you and your family that if you went and bought a trinket to the God Asclepius or a vase and put it in your room that had been blessed by the priests from Jack's in the Agora or Stavros is in the Agora or whoever it was, then you might get better earlier. So they were selling you medallions, trinkets, vases, sculptures, etc. All again to give you hope that this might endear you to Asclepius and let him hear your prayers and hopes. The whole thing became, as I said, to an extent corrupted, in my opinion. Now, I'm sure lots of people will agree with me. You know, the classical Greeks were ethical and moral, but I don't think they were. And I think it's really interesting to look at this place from the perspective of, as I said, the people who were coming here and probably getting fleeced because they were desperate and they needed hope and comfort. You're running a commercial enterprise, it's successful, you're bringing people in. What do you do to continue growing your business? Well, the obvious thing in the classical Greek ancient world was to open a stadium, and we see the stadium here. This was opened about 350 BC. It held games every 4 years, and games, sporting games, were incredibly important in the ancient Greek world, and they brought people in here. So no longer were you simply a religious site that was offering healing to people. You were associating, as we do nowadays, health with sport, and you were bringing people in here for games and activities and utilising the facilities far beyond those who were just coming here for healing. At the end of the 4th century, the people who owned or ran or operated or had the rights to Epidaurus were obviously rolling in money because they had the religious site, they had their hotel, they had their Hestiatorium, the catering, they had the stadium, and then they built, 50 years after the stadium, this theatre, the Theatre of Epidavros. Now this is why everyone comes here. It seats 14,000, but by this stage For me, this site had completely changed its purpose. It was no longer a religious site of healing. Yes, people probably still came here to be healed, but the main purpose of this was to take money from people, to entertain people, and they put on Greek tragedies here. And for those interested, it holds 14,000 people. It was unknown until about 1881 when they started digging in the hillside here and excavated this place, and it's now the location of the world-famous Epidaurus Theatre Festival. Every July and August, they have a theatre festival here for a month. They put on Greek tragedies, they put on modern Greek plays, and world-famous actors have participated. So, as I mentioned, started in the 6th century, reached its zenith in the 4th century, carried on through the 3rd and 2nd centuries until the 1st century when a general called Sala came through here at a time of war and absolutely destroyed the place. And that, to a point, was the end of Epidavros as a centre of healing. But what happened was the Romans loved ancient Greece, and they effectively took sites like this and turned them into tourist resorts. Literally tourist resorts. They used to go to Sparta, they used to come to Epidavros on holiday to visit places which had existed before them. And you need to remember that the Romans to the classical Greeks were as far as we were to Leonardo da Vinci. We're talking 500 years. It was a bit like us visiting Florence today. We go to Florence to see the Renaissance, to see the works of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And the Romans were doing exactly the same here. So after the sacking of this place in the 1st century BC, it was effectively ruined until the Romans came along at the end of the 1st century AD, and Hadrian visited here. Emperor Hadrian visited here in 124 AD, and it recreated the place. They built these baths. Now, these baths used to be on Greek baths, but they built these Roman baths specifically for the visit of Emperor Hadrian. And he came here and stayed several days and bathed at this site, and it made the place incredibly popular with the Romans. It became a tourist attraction. And yet again, this place became incredibly important as a pilgrimage for people. But it was not a pilgrimage for health. It was a pilgrimage as a tourist to see the classical Greek forefathers and the site that they used to occupy prior to the Roman Empire itself. And the Romans built several things here on top of the Greek buildings in order to, again, create a commercial operation which would bring their people in, create wealth and money. Following the visit of the Emperor Hadrian, 124 AD, the Romans developed this place rather like the Greeks had 500 years before, and they wanted people to come and enjoy their Florence, as I've called it. And for example, this building back here is an Odeon. You can see it's built into the Hestatorium. The columns of the Hestatorium are built into the walls of the Odeon. 500 years between these two buildings, and you don't get that understanding unless you understand the people who are coming here. But an Odeon is an indoor theatre, so you would come here, you would be a tourist, you would explore Florence, the Greek classical Epidavros of 500 years previous, and you'd watch a theatre display, maybe reenacting some of what happened here as the Romans perceived it. But then what happened to this place? Well, in about 395 AD, the Roman Empire in this area fell, and the Goths came through and they razed it to the ground, and it has never been rebuilt since. What we have here is what was left by the Goths after they sacked it in 395 AD. But prior to that, this place had 800 years of history, starting in 600 BC with a religious site, developing into the highly commercialised classical Greek operation that we've seen, with the theatre, with the stadium, with the Hestatorium, with the hotel, and then after its demise in Greek war and Roman war, being rebuilt by the Romans as a tourist destination, somewhere to explore from the past 500 years prior.